1865. More people died on this river in one night than on the Titanic. You've never heard of it. That's not an accident. They'd already survived the American Civil War. Union soldiers held in Confederate prison camps that starved men down to nothing. And then, the war ended. They were finally going home. 2,000 of them, packed onto a single steamboat, built to carry 376 people. 7 miles outside Memphis, Tennessee, that boat exploded, killing more Americans than the Titanic ever did. And somehow, almost nobody was ever punished for it. Here's how it happened, and here's who got away with it. To understand how 2,000 men ended up on a boat built for 400, you have to go back a few months, to two of the worst prison camps of the entire war, and to the river city that would eventually bring the men who survived them together. The American Civil War ran from 1861 to 1865. The Union, the northern states loyal to the federal government, against the Confederacy, 11 southern states that seceded specifically to preserve and expand slavery. That's not a matter of debate. It's written directly into their own declarations of secession at the time. The Union fought first to hold the country together, and by 1863, explicitly to end slavery as well. 4 years and roughly 750,000 deaths later, the Confederacy surrendered. Which brings us back to those two camps, and the men who survived them. Andersonville camp held prisoners in open fields with almost no shelter. Disease and starvation did the rest. Cahaba camp was smaller, and by some survivor accounts marginally less lethal. But it flooded constantly, crammed hundreds of men into a building that was never meant to hold people, with no bunks and standing water for weeks at a stretch. Both camps were about to empty out within weeks of each other, and the men who walked out of them were about to end up in the very same place, Vicksburg. The two camps sat hundreds of miles apart, in Georgia and Alabama. But there was one city close enough for both groups of men to reach, Vicksburg, Mississippi, a Union-controlled port city on the Mississippi River. It was the nearest major river crossing still under Union control, which made it the natural place to gather paroled prisoners from across the region and put them on boats headed north. Almost 5,000 of them made their way there, to a hastily built holding camp about 4 miles outside the city called Camp Fisk, to wait for a boat home. The government was paying steamboat companies by the head to carry them. For a struggling riverboat business, this was the biggest payday of the war. Captain James Cass Mason needed that payday badly. River trade was slow. But his boat, the Sultana, had one advantage. She just set a speed record on her last run upriver. The Sultana was launched in Cincinnati, Ohio, in January of 1863. She was 260 feet long, nearly the length of a football field, a wooden-hulled, side-wheel steamboat, pushed forward by 2 large paddle wheels, one mounted on each side of the hull. She was built for the cotton trade. She ran on 4 tubular boilers, each 18 feet long and 46 inches across, packed with narrow flues that let her generate roughly twice the steam of older boiler designs. Powerful, efficient, and only safe if the water inside them was managed exactly right, every hour of every trip. While Mason's crew serviced the ship at the Vicksburg landing, another kind of trouble was already finding him. Captain Reuben Hatch, the Army's chief quartermaster in the region, ran supplies and transport for the troops there. He offered Mason a deal: pay a kickback, and he'd guarantee the Sultana at least 1,000 paroled prisoners. One problem: the Sultana was legally rated for 376 people, total. One decision here mattered more than anyone realized at the time. When the Sultana limped back into the Vicksburg landing, one of her 4 boilers had a bulging, leaking plate, thin iron that had been overheated so many times it was starting to give way along its seam. The mechanic on site wanted to cut the damaged section out entirely and rivet in a proper new plate, the correct fix. The ship's chief engineer, Nathan Wintringer, knew that repair would take 2 to 3 days, days that would cost the Sultana her promised load of prisoners. So instead, they hammered the bulged section back into roughly its original shape and riveted a thin iron patch directly over it, on top of the weakest kind of seam a boiler can have, a single overlapping lap joint, rather than replacing the metal underneath it. What should have taken days took about one. That patch didn't fix the boiler. It covered the symptom and left the underlying problem, brittle, overheated iron, exactly where it was, now with an extra stress point riveted on top of it. Almost nobody understood this part in 1865, and engineers only fully explained it more than a century later in a 2015 investigation. The Sultana's boilers were fed straight from the Mississippi River with no filtering. That water carried a steady load of fine silt, a small amount in any 1 gallon, but the boilers ran non-stop, day after day. That silt settled to the bottom of the boiler and baked into a hard layer of scale, right where the fire underneath was hottest. Scale acts like insulation. It stops heat from passing efficiently into the water above it. So the iron plate under that scale layer kept absorbing heat from the fire below with nowhere for that heat to go. It scorched. Over and over, trip after trip, that plate got heated far hotter than it was ever designed for, then cooled again. And each cycle made the already brittle iron a little more brittle. And because those boiler tubes were packed in so tight, there was barely room to fit a brush between them. Nobody could scrub that sediment layer out properly between trips. It just kept building. So by the time the Sultana left Vicksburg, one boiler had brittle iron from years of scale-driven overheating, a freshly riveted patch sitting on its weakest seam, and 6 times the legal number of people about to stand on her decks. The Sultana left Vicksburg carrying close to 2,400 people, a boat built for 376. They sang as she pushed north. The Mississippi River was in full spring flood that April, high, fast, and running against her the entire way north. To make any progress at all, let alone hold her speed record, Mason needed his engineers keeping steam pressure high, hour after hour, for 2 straight days. Every one of those hours put more heat and more strain directly through that freshly patched, already brittle seam. A patch is not a repair, it's a delay. And the Sultana spent 2 days finding out exactly how long that delay would last. She reached Memphis on the evening of April 26th, took on coal, and kept going. 10 miles above the city, most of the men on board were asleep. Then, in less than a second, it happened. A deafening roar, a blinding flash, and the middle of the Sultana was simply gone. Men thrown into fire, into wreckage, into the freezing dark of the river below, most of them still half asleep and not yet understanding what had hit them. The center of the boat was simply gone. Men who'd survived combat in prison camps, many of whom couldn't swim, were thrown straight into the flooded, freezing river, or trapped as the wooden hull burned around them. Nearly every tree along the flooded bank had someone clinging to it. People sang or mimicked bird calls in the dark, just to hold on to their minds through the cold. A teenage survivor reached the Memphis waterfront and raised the alarm. Rescue boats fanned out within the hour. Roughly 800 people were pulled from the water. Nearly 300 of them died in the hospital anyway. Burns, hypothermia, injuries too severe to survive. Bodies kept surfacing downriver for months, some as far as Vicksburg. Many were never found. To this day, historians still argue over how many died, anywhere from 1,100 to over 1,700. What we do know for certain, it's still the deadliest maritime disaster in United States history. Within hours, the Army opened an investigation, then a second one. The United States Congress got involved too. The man they put on trial was Captain Frederick Speed, the officer who organized the loading at the Vicksburg landing. In June of 1866, the court found him guilty on all charges. Sentence: dismissal from the Army. Then the verdict was overturned. The Judge Advocate General, the Army's top legal officer, reviewed the case and reversed it, writing that there was, quote, no evidence that it was caused by the overcrowding of her decks, and that it was difficult to say upon whom the responsibility should rest. A boat carrying 6 times its legal limit. And officially, nobody was really to blame. As for Captain Hatch, the man who arranged the original bribe, He never stood trial at all. He resigned, ignored 3 separate subpoenas, and vanished from the investigation. He had letters of recommendation in his file from President Abraham Lincoln and General Ulysses S. Grant, the Union's top military commander. He died in 1871, having never once faced a courtroom. Captain Mason, the man who patched a failing boiler and packed his boat 6 times past its limit, he went down with his own ship. The official military commission investigating the disaster went even further, concluding that the government, quote, has transferred as many or more troops on boats of no greater capacity than the Sultana, frequently and with safety. This wasn't a horrifying exception. It was normal practice. It just happened to go catastrophically wrong this once. For 150 years, the official explanation was that the overloaded boat rocked side to side, exposing dry, red-hot metal inside the boiler, and that water sloshing back onto that metal flashed instantly into steam. It's a vivid story. Investigators at the time believed it. It's probably wrong. The Sultana's own chief engineer said the boilers were full of water right up until the moment of the blast. Survivors said the river was calm. Modern boiler engineers now believe something different happened, based on a full engineering review of the wreck evidence completed in 2015. 2 days of hard steaming had pushed one boiler's pressure to somewhere around 130 to 140 pounds per square inch, with water inside superheated to well over 300 degrees Fahrenheit, kept liquid only because it was sealed under that pressure. Then, at the weakest point in the entire ship, that thin patch riveted over a brittle, scale-scorched seam, the metal finally gave way. A crack opened. The instant that crack opened, pressure inside the boiler collapsed toward zero. And superheated water doesn't calmly depressurize. It flashes. In a fraction of a second, hundreds of pounds of water inside that boiler turned to steam, expanding to hundreds of times its original volume. By some estimates, over 1,000 times. That expansion didn't vent, it detonated, tearing the boiler apart and slamming a shockwave of steam, water, and debris straight into the boilers sitting right beside it. Weakened by the same sediment, the same brittle iron, the same 2 days of strain, they went with it. 3 of the Sultana's 4 boilers ruptured within moments of each other. The blast blew straight up and forward through the decks above, taking the smokestacks, the pilot house, and everyone standing there with it. And it blew the fireboxes open too, scattering burning coals across a wooden ship packed with sleeping men. What the explosion didn't kill outright, the fire did. To understand why almost nobody heard about the Sultana at the time, you have to go back 13 days earlier, before the Sultana exploded. On April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. He died the next morning. This is where it gets strange. When that news broke, the Sultana herself was docked in a small southern Illinois town. Captain Mason sent his crew scrambling through town to gather every newspaper they could find, then rushed south down the Mississippi River, spreading word of the president's assassination to towns that hadn't heard yet. The same ship that carried that news down the river would, less than 2 weeks later, become a tragedy the country barely noticed. Lincoln's assassin was John Wilkes Booth, a famous, successful stage actor and an outspoken Confederate sympathizer who hated Lincoln and opposed the end of slavery. For 12 days after the shooting, the entire country's attention was locked on the manhunt for Booth. He was finally cornered and killed at a farm in Virginia on April 26, 1865. 1 day later, April 27th, the Sultana exploded. The nation's newspapers were still consumed with the end of John Booth. There simply wasn't room left for another tragedy, even one that killed more people than the Titanic ever would. Today, the wreck lies buried more than 30 feet under a soybean field in Arkansas. The river shifted course generations ago, leaving her nearly 2 miles from the water that sank her. A few miles from the wreck site, in the small town of Marion, Arkansas, the Sultana Disaster Museum holds what's left: pieces of the boilers that failed, timbers that burned, and the names of the men who never made it home. The Sultana was proud of her speed. It's the reason Captain Mason pushed her upriver against a flooded current instead of resting a boiler that needed rest. The reason more than 2,000 men went on one boat. The reason a one-day patch replaced a 3-day repair. Every rushed decision in this story traces back to the same instinct. Get there faster, worry about the cost later. No one was ever really held responsible for the Sultana. Not the chief engineer who patched a failing boiler. Not the captain who paid a bribe. Not the officer who took it. Not the government that called this kind of overcrowding routine. These men had already survived the worst that war could do to them. It was the trip home that killed them. If you want to dig deeper, check sources in the description. And if you want more stories like this, hitting like and subscribing genuinely helps. It's what keeps us going.